In 1812, the United States was still a young republic, barely 3 decades removed from independence, but already convinced of its continental destiny. Expansion was not merely a political goal, it was an assumption. To American leaders in Washington, British North America, what we now call Canada, appeared less like a sovereign territory and more like an unfinished chapter of the Revolution. It was sparsely populated, thinly defended, and tied to a British Empire that was locked in a life-or-death struggle against Napoleon in Europe. Many believed its fall would be inevitable. Thomas Jefferson famously predicted that taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching. It was a statement that captured the mood of the time, confident, impatient, and dangerously optimistic. Yet beneath that confidence lay a deeper set of motivations. The War of 1812 was not simply about territory. It was born from trade restrictions imposed by Britain during the Napoleonic Wars, the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, and the growing belief in what would later be called manifest destiny, the idea that the American Republic was destined to dominate the North American continent. President James Madison, under pressure from expansionist war hawks in Congress, signed the Declaration of War in June 1812. The strategy that followed was bold but deceptively simple. Invade Canada from multiple fronts, overwhelm the small British garrisons, and force London to negotiate from a position of weakness. On paper, the arithmetic favored the United States. The American population stood at roughly 7.5 million people. British North America had fewer than 500,000 inhabitants. The U.S. had more manpower, greater agricultural output, and the initiative. Britain, meanwhile, was consumed by its war against Napoleon, its best troops fighting in Spain and Portugal, and its navy blockading Europe. Canada was not London's priority. In fact, the defense of the colony relied on a small number of British regulars, colonial militia, and alliances with indigenous nations who had their own reasons to resist American expansion. American planners assumed this imbalance would translate into quick success. The invasion plan involved 3 major thrusts, one from Detroit into Upper Canada, another across the Niagara frontier, and a third down the Lake Champlain corridor toward Montreal, the strategic heart of British supply lines. If Montreal fell, the British interior would be cut off from reinforcements arriving via the St. Lawrence River. The campaign would collapse and Canada would follow. But the plan rested on assumptions that proved deeply flawed. Washington believed that the population of Canada would not resist. Many Americans assumed French Canadians resented British rule and would welcome liberation. Others believed recent American immigrants living in Upper Canada would side with their former homeland. The invasion was framed not as conquest, but as emancipation. This belief shaped early American operations and fostered a dangerous complacency. In July 1812, Brigadier General William Hull led the first major American force across the Detroit River into Canadian territory. Hull issued proclamations promising peace and security to civilians who remained neutral, while warning of destruction for those who resisted alongside British or Indigenous forces. It was a declaration rooted in confidence and hubris. The Americans expected loyalty or submission. Instead, they encountered resistance shaped by loyalty, fear, and survival. To understand why the American advance stalled almost immediately, one must look beyond numbers and examine the forces defending the frontier. The British presence in Canada was small but professional. Fewer than 6,000 regular troops were stationed across Upper and Lower Canada at the start of the war. These men, drawn from regiments like the 41st and 49th Foot, were career soldiers hardened by discipline and training. They lacked numbers but possessed cohesion and experience that militia forces often did not. Supporting them were colonial militias, farmers, traders, and settlers who knew the terrain intimately, and indigenous allies who had long resisted American encroachment. Geography also played a decisive role. The Canadian frontier was not a conventional battlefield. Dense forests, rivers, and vast distances made large-scale troop movements difficult. Supply lines were fragile. Control of waterways, particularly the Great Lakes, was essential. Whoever dominated these inland seas could move men and supplies quickly while isolating the enemy. The British Provincial Marine, though small, initially held an advantage in navigating these waters, allowing them to redeploy forces rapidly to threatened areas. Yet perhaps the most important factor was leadership. The defense of Upper Canada fell largely to Major General Isaac Brock, a British officer whose energy and decisiveness would define the early phase of the war. Brock understood something American planners did not. Perception mattered as much as reality. If Canada appeared weak, its population might hesitate, and Indigenous alliances might falter. If Canada struck back aggressively, it could create the illusion of strength even when resources were limited. Brock chose action over caution, even when his superiors urged restraint. His strategy was not simply to defend territory, but to disrupt American confidence and rally every available ally. Among those allies was Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader attempting to unite indigenous nations into a confederacy capable of resisting American expansion. Tecumseh viewed the war as an opportunity to preserve his people's lands and autonomy. Brock recognized the strategic importance of this alliance. Their cooperation created a formidable partnership. British discipline combined with indigenous knowledge of the terrain and mobility in irregular warfare, it was a union that would soon shock American forces and reshape the course of the conflict. By the time the first major clashes began, it was clear the American assumption of an easy conquest had been misplaced. The war would not be decided by population statistics or political ambition. It would be determined by leadership, alliances, geography, and the willingness of ordinary people, British, colonial, and indigenous, to fight for survival. The mere matter of marching had already begun to unravel, and the northern frontier was about to become one of the most fiercely contested theaters of the early 19th century. The illusion of a swift American victory began to collapse almost immediately after the first invasion columns crossed into Upper Canada. What had been planned in Washington as a coordinated campaign quickly turned into a series of hesitant advances, confused leadership decisions, and logistical failures that exposed the fragility of the American strategy. The war had started with confidence, but it soon descended into uncertainty. The first major turning point came at Detroit in August 1812, and it would shape the psychological trajectory of the entire conflict. General William Hull, already struggling with supply shortages, unreliable militia, and the constant threat of indigenous raids along his communication lines, found himself facing an enemy far more organized and aggressive than anticipated. Across the river stood British Major General Isaac Brock and his ally Tecumseh, commanding a force that, on paper, was smaller than Hull's. Yet Brock understood that numbers alone did not win wars. He crafted a strategy built on deception and momentum. By moving troops visibly across open ground, repeatedly marching the same men in different uniforms, and allowing indigenous warriors to be seen and heard in large numbers around the perimeter, Brock created the impression of overwhelming strength. Hull, already shaken by reports of indigenous attacks and fearing a massacre if his position collapsed, began to doubt his ability to hold Detroit. Tecumseh's presence amplified that fear. American officers knew his reputation, and rumors of thousands of warriors surrounding the fort spread rapidly among the troops. The psychological pressure was immense. On August 16, 1812, without a major battle, Hull surrendered Detroit and the entire American force under his command. It was one of the most shocking capitulations in early American military history. Not only had a strategic city fallen, but the surrender handed the British control of the Michigan Territory and large quantities of weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The impact on American morale was devastating. The war that was supposed to be an easy expansion had begun with humiliation. The loss at Detroit did more than shift territory. It reshaped perceptions. Indigenous nations across the frontier saw that the United States could be resisted. Canadian settlers saw that the British were willing and able to defend them. American citizens, meanwhile, began to question the competence of their military leadership and the assumptions that had driven the invasion in the first place. But Detroit was only the beginning. Along the Niagara frontier, another major axis of the invasion, American forces attempted to push into Upper Canada late in 1812. The crossing at Queenston Heights became the next defining clash. American troops managed to land and initially gain ground, climbing the steep heights overlooking the Niagara River. For a moment, it appeared the invasion might succeed, but again, the coordination faltered. Militia units on the American side hesitated to cross the river, citing legal limits on serving outside U.S. territory. Regular troops found themselves isolated on the Canadian side, facing a rapidly organizing defense. Isaac Brock, leading from the front, moved quickly to counterattack. In one of the most dramatic moments of the war, Brock personally led a charge to retake the heights. He was killed in the fighting, becoming one of the first major British casualties of the conflict, but his death did not halt the momentum he had created. British regulars and indigenous allies pressed forward, encircling the American position. Cut off and outnumbered, American forces were forced to surrender once again. The defeat at Queenston Heights confirmed a pattern. American invasions lacked cohesion, while British and Canadian defenses, though smaller, operated with unity and purpose. Geography and logistics continued to undermine American efforts. Moving large forces across the frontier required reliable supply chains, and these were constantly threatened. Roads were primitive, rivers unpredictable, and distances immense. The Great Lakes became a central battleground, not just for military engagements, but for control of transportation itself. Whoever commanded these waters could reinforce distant positions and disrupt the enemy's movement. Early in the war, the British held a slight advantage, allowing them to shift forces between Detroit, Niagara, and Montreal more efficiently than the Americans could respond. Political divisions inside the United States also played a role. The war was not universally popular. Federalists in New England opposed it strongly, seeing it as a reckless conflict driven by expansionist Southern and Western politicians. Funding, recruitment, and coordination suffered as a result. State militias often resisted federal command, and the lack of a unified national war effort slowed every campaign. Meanwhile, in British North America, the stakes were existential. For Canadians, this was not a distant political conflict. It was a fight for survival. If the United States succeeded, the colonies would disappear. That reality fostered a level of cooperation between British authorities, colonial leaders, and Indigenous nations that the Americans struggled to match. The British Empire, though stretched thin by the Napoleonic Wars, still provided structure, discipline, and global resources that could be redirected when necessary. By the end of 1812, the situation had shifted dramatically from American expectations. Instead of occupying Canadian cities, the United States found itself defending its own frontier. The war had become a test of endurance rather than a quick campaign. Both sides began preparing for a longer conflict, one that would extend across multiple fronts: the Great Lakes, the Atlantic coast, and eventually deep into American territory itself. The early defeats forced Washington to reconsider its strategy. New commanders were appointed. Naval construction on the Great Lakes accelerated. Training and organization improved slowly. But the central reality remained. Canada would not fall easily. The war had evolved into a contest not just of armies, but of systems, logistics, alliances, leadership, and the ability to sustain a fight over time. The next phase would determine whether the United States could recover from its early failures, or whether the British and their allies would push the conflict onto American soil. By 1813, the war had entered a new and more brutal phase. The early American defeats had shattered the illusion of a swift conquest, but they had also triggered a transformation inside the United States military. Washington replaced ineffective commanders, expanded training, and began building a navy capable of contesting British control of the Great Lakes. The conflict was no longer about a quick march into Canada. It had become a prolonged struggle for control of supply routes, territory, and morale. The Great Lakes emerged as the central artery of the war. In a landscape dominated by forests and waterways, whoever controlled these inland seas controlled the movement of armies. Shipyards sprang to life on both sides of the border. In places like Kingston, York, and Sackett's Harbor, carpenters worked day and night to construct warships from fresh-cut timber. Entire fleets were built in remote frontier settlements, an industrial race conducted far from the traditional centers of power. The naval struggle reached its decisive moment on Lake Erie in September 1813. American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry had assembled a fleet under extreme conditions, hauling supplies across rough terrain and constructing vessels in a matter of months. When his squadron confronted the British fleet, the battle was fierce and close. At one point, Perry's flagship was nearly destroyed, forcing him to row under fire to another ship to continue the fight. The American victory that followed was complete. The entire British squadron on Lake Erie was captured, severing Britain's ability to supply its western forces. The consequences were immediate. Without naval support, British troops were forced to abandon Detroit and retreat deeper into Upper Canada. The withdrawal exposed Indigenous allies who had relied on British supplies and protection. It also led directly to one of the most tragic turning points of the war: the death of Tecumseh. During the retreat, British and Indigenous forces made a stand near the Thames River in October 1813. The American army, reinforced and determined to reclaim its reputation, pressed forward aggressively. In the battle that followed, British lines collapsed, and Tecumseh was killed. His death marked the end of the Indigenous Confederacy he had worked tirelessly to build. Without his leadership, the alliance that had threatened American expansion began to fracture. The Western theater, once stabilized by British Indigenous cooperation, fell increasingly under American control. Yet the war was far from decided. While disaster struck in the West, the British held firm in the East, particularly along the St. Lawrence River and the Niagara frontier. Montreal remained the strategic heart of the defense. As long as the British maintained that corridor, reinforcements and supplies from the Atlantic could continue to flow into the interior. American planners understood this and shifted their focus accordingly. In late 1813, a major offensive aimed at Montreal was launched. The strategy involved a coordinated advance from multiple directions designed to overwhelm British defenses. But once again, logistics and coordination undermined the effort. American forces struggled with terrain, communication failures, and command disagreements. The campaign stalled before reaching its objective, preserving the British lifeline. On the Niagara frontier, the war grew increasingly savage. Towns were burned, farms destroyed, and civilians displaced. The conflict no longer resembled the limited campaigns of earlier European wars. It had become a frontier war of attrition. Each side retaliated for the actions of the other, escalating the violence. American troops burned York, the capital of Upper Canada, in 1813, destroying public buildings and supplies. In response, British and Canadian forces later launched retaliatory raids across the border. The frontier descended into a cycle of destruction. Meanwhile, the naval arms race on Lake Ontario intensified. Both sides constructed increasingly large warships, some rivaling the size of European naval vessels. Yet despite the buildup, neither fleet achieved decisive dominance. Instead, they maneuvered cautiously, Aware that losing a single fleet could shift the balance of the entire war, control of the lake remained contested, ensuring that the conflict dragged on. The year also marked a shift in the composition of American forces. Early reliance on militia had proven unreliable. Now, trained regular troops began to take the field in greater numbers. Commanders like Winfield Scott introduced European-style discipline and tactics, transforming American units into more effective fighting forces. Battles that followed were more evenly matched, and British victories were no longer guaranteed. At the same time, the broader geopolitical situation began to change. In Europe, Napoleon's power was weakening. Britain, which had been forced to divide its attention between continents, now prepared to redirect experienced troops to North America. The war that had begun as a secondary theater for the British Empire was about to receive reinforcements hardened by years of fighting in Spain and Portugal. This shift would dramatically alter the balance. For Canada, survival still depended on holding key positions long enough for those reinforcements to arrive. The war had already proven that the colonies could resist, but endurance alone would not secure victory. The next phase would test whether Britain could transform defense into retaliation, and whether the United States, now more organized and determined, could finally achieve the breakthrough it had failed to secure in the early years of the conflict. By 1814, the war had reached a critical turning point. For 2 years, British North America had fought largely on the defensive, relying on limited manpower, fragile alliances, and control of key waterways to hold off American invasions. But the global situation was changing rapidly. In Europe, Napoleon's empire was collapsing. His abdication in the spring of 1814 freed thousands of experienced British soldiers who had spent years fighting in the brutal campaigns of the Peninsular War. For the first time since the conflict began, the British Empire could focus serious attention on North America. Reinforcements began crossing the Atlantic, bringing with them hardened veterans, improved supplies, and a renewed strategic confidence. This shift transformed the character of the war. What had once been a defensive struggle for survival now carried the possibility of retaliation. British commanders understood that simply holding Canada was no longer enough. They needed to pressure the United States directly, forcing Washington to reconsider the cost of continuing the conflict. Meanwhile, the American Army had also evolved. Early failures had forced reforms. Units were better trained, discipline had improved, and leadership was more experienced. The United States was no longer the disorganized force that had stumbled at Detroit and Queenston Heights. When the next major confrontations came, they would be far more evenly matched. The Niagara frontier became the focal point of this renewed struggle. In July 1814, American forces launched another invasion across the river, capturing Fort Erie and pushing deeper into Upper Canada. Unlike earlier campaigns, this advance was deliberate and organized. American regulars maneuvered with precision, supported by artillery and coordinated command. The British response was swift. Reinforced by veterans from Europe, they moved to confront the invasion before it could gain momentum. The clash that followed at Lundy's Lane near Niagara Falls became one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Fought in the late afternoon and continuing into the night, the engagement was chaotic and brutal. Both sides struggled for control of high ground where British artillery dominated the field. American troops launched repeated assaults to capture the guns, at times succeeding only to be pushed back by counterattacks. As darkness fell, the battlefield descended into confusion. Units fired at shadows, lines blurred, and hand-to-hand combat erupted around the artillery positions. The roar of musket fire and cannon blended with the constant rumble of the nearby falls, creating an atmosphere of relentless violence. Casualties mounted rapidly. Officers on both sides were wounded or killed, and command structures strained under the pressure. By midnight, neither army had achieved a decisive breakthrough. Exhausted and short on ammunition, the Americans withdrew, leaving the British in possession of the field. Strategically, Lundy's Lane marked the end of serious American attempts to invade the interior of Canada. The offensive momentum had been broken. The American army fell back toward Fort Erie, where the fighting continued in the form of a prolonged siege. Weeks of artillery bombardments, failed assaults, and disease took their toll. Eventually, American forces abandoned the fort and withdrew across the river, effectively ending the invasion. Yet even as the northern frontier stabilized, the war took a dramatic turn elsewhere. With reinforcements now available, Britain launched retaliatory operations along the American coast. In August 1814, British troops landed near Washington. D.C., the American capital, poorly defended, fell quickly. Government buildings, including the White House and the Capitol, were set ablaze in retaliation for earlier American attacks in Canada. The spectacle shocked the young republic. The war that had begun with American ambitions of conquest had now reached its own political heart. Despite these dramatic actions, neither side could achieve a decisive victory. The United States lacked the strength to conquer Canada, and Britain had little interest in occupying large portions of American territory for long. The war had become costly, unpopular, and strategically ambiguous. Economies were strained, trade disrupted, and public support wavering on both sides of the Atlantic. Diplomacy began to replace battlefield strategy. Negotiations opened in the neutral city of Ghent, where American and British representatives sought a way out of the conflict. Months of discussion produced a simple agreement: restore the situation to what it had been before the war. No major territory would change hands. The conflict would end without a clear victor. For the United States, the war became a symbol of resilience, particularly after later victories like the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the treaty had already been signed. For Britain, it remained a secondary theater, overshadowed by the struggle against Napoleon. But for the inhabitants of British North America, the war carried a different meaning entirely. They had faced invasion, endured destruction, and survived. The colonies had not been absorbed. Instead, they had been forced to cooperate. British officials, colonial settlers, and indigenous nations fighting side by side against a common threat. The experience fostered a growing sense of identity separate from both Britain and the United States. The final chapter of the war would reveal the cost of that survival, especially for the indigenous nations whose alliances had played a decisive role in defending Canada. The final chapter of the War of 1812 did not unfold on a battlefield, but in negotiation rooms, abandoned forts, and the scarred landscapes left behind by 3 years of conflict. When the Treaty of Ghent was signed in December 1814, it officially ended the war between the United States and Great Britain. The agreement restored borders to their pre-war positions and avoided any major territorial concessions. On paper, it looked as though nothing had changed. But in reality, everything had. The war had reshaped identities, exposed vulnerabilities, and redrawn the psychological map of North America. For the British Empire, the war confirmed that Canada could not be defended through imperial authority alone. It required local loyalty, cooperation between English and French populations, and alliances with indigenous nations. The defense of the colonies had been fragile, improvised, and often desperate. Yet it had held. For the United States, the war shattered the illusion of an easy northern expansion. The assumption that Canada would collapse or welcome American liberation proved disastrously wrong. The war exposed weaknesses in American planning, leadership, and logistics, forcing a long-term reevaluation of military structure and national strategy. But the deepest consequences fell on the indigenous nations, who had fought alongside British forces. Throughout the war, British officers had encouraged indigenous alliances, promising protection of territory and recognition of sovereignty in the Northwest. These assurances were central to securing support from leaders like Tecumseh and the warriors who joined the fight across the frontier. Yet, when peace negotiations began, those promises were quietly abandoned. British diplomats prioritized ending the war and stabilizing relations with the United States. The proposed creation of an indigenous buffer state in the Northwest was dropped from negotiations. When the treaty was finalized, indigenous nations were not present at the table. Their future had been decided without them. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Without British military backing, indigenous confederacies fractured. American expansion resumed rapidly into the Old Northwest, and the balance of power that had briefly slowed settlement collapsed. The death of Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 had already weakened resistance. The treaty sealed the outcome. Indigenous lands became increasingly vulnerable to encroachment, displacement, and federal control. The alliance that had helped save Canada dissolved almost overnight. For British North America, however, the war left a different legacy. The colonies had survived against overwhelming odds. American invasions had been repelled, cities defended, and supply routes maintained despite limited resources. The experience forged a new sense of unity among populations that had previously viewed each other with suspicion. English loyalists, French-Canadian volunteers, and colonial militias had fought side by side. This cooperation laid the groundwork for a distinct identity that was neither fully British nor American. The war also altered British strategic thinking. After 1812, London increasingly viewed Canada not merely as a colony to administer, but as a territory to preserve through diplomacy, infrastructure, and local governance. Defensive fortifications were expanded, supply routes strengthened, and colonial institutions encouraged to grow more self-reliant. The aim was no longer simply to hold the territory, but to ensure it could stand if challenged again. The memory of invasion remained powerful. Across Upper and Lower Canada, stories of the war circulated for decades. Tales of Brock's leadership, the defense of Queenston Heights, and the survival of small communities against invading armies became part of local identity. The narrative was not always precise and sometimes romanticized, but it carried a lasting truth. The colonies had endured a moment when their existence was uncertain, and they had emerged intact. For the United States, the war became framed differently. It was remembered as a second war of independence, proof that the Republic could stand against Britain once more. Victories at sea and battles like New Orleans, fought after the treaty had already been signed, shaped national pride. The failures in Canada faded into the background of the national story. Yet strategically, the war marked a turning point. American leaders increasingly turned their attention westward rather than northward. Expansion would come through the interior of the continent, not through conquest of British territories. The border that had been contested through invasion slowly stabilized into one of the longest peaceful frontiers in the world. The War of 1812 ended without a clear military victor, but its consequences were profound. It secured the survival of British North America, reshaped American military ambition, and marked a devastating shift for indigenous nations caught between empires. It demonstrated that geography, alliances, leadership, and resilience could outweigh raw numbers and initial confidence. It also revealed the limits of imperial power. Britain could defend Canada, but not reshape the continent without cost. The United States could challenge an empire, but not easily absorb neighboring societies. And indigenous nations, despite extraordinary efforts, were ultimately sidelined in a conflict that had unfolded across their own lands. In the years that followed, the war's memory hardened into myth and identity. In Canada, it became a story of survival and unity. In the United States, a symbol of endurance and national pride. In Britain, it faded into the broader narrative of the Napoleonic era. But beneath those interpretations remained a more complex reality. The war had not been inevitable, nor had its outcome been certain. It was shaped by decisions, miscalculations, alliances, and moments of courage that determined whether a young republic would expand northward or whether a fragile colonial frontier would hold. In the end, Canada survived, not because it was stronger, but because enough people, soldiers, militia, indigenous warriors, and civilians, refused to let it disappear. And in that refusal, a nation that had not yet fully existed began to take form.